Hello and welcome to this course called Professional Communication. Before we start looking at the first module in this course, I'm just going to give you a quick introduction about myself, and then we can look at the introduction to the course and you'll see what you can expect. So, hello, nice to meet you all. My name is Luke Pierce and I'm from Sheffield in the UK. And I'll just now give you a bit of background about my academic and professional experience. So I've worked for a long time as an English teacher, and I've done that in the UK and overseas in Spain and Australia for a few years. And I've taught all sorts of different courses to adults and children, things like business English and academic English. And more recently, I've been teaching English for academic purposes at places like the University of Sheffield and Imperial College London, which famously has a focus on STEM, so English for specific purposes. In terms of my qualifications, I have my undergrad degree from the University of Exeter, where I studied politics and Spanish. And then after I moved to Spain, I got my CELTA, which is a TEFL qualification from Cambridge. After that, I did a PGCE, which is an English teaching qualification. And most recently, I did my Master's in Education and Language, which I got from the University of Sheffield. And currently, I work at UCL, a university here in London, and I work in the English department in the survey of English usage. And I work on a project called Englicious, which you can find online, which is about providing free resources about English grammar to teachers in the UK, and we do training teachers and fun things like that. So that's a little bit about me. Let's jump right into verbal and non-verbal communication. So what are the learning objectives? We'll do this with every presentation, so you have an idea of what you should be able to do by the end of the course. So at the end of this session, you'll be able to define the importance of professional communication, recall the features of professional communication, and distinguish the general differences between verbal and non-verbal communication. So like I said, this is an introduction. We'll be looking more at, in general, the overall differences, but we'll look at the specifics in modules to come. So professional communication, let's just break that down and explain what that means. So obviously, in all aspects of life, it's important to communicate, whether that's formal or informal, or with family or friends, whoever your audience is. But we're thinking about business, obviously, in this professional communication module. So in global business, for quite a long time now, English has been a lingua franca, obviously not the only lingua franca, but maybe the most global lingua franca. And lingua franca is a language that many speakers use to communicate. So even speakers of different native languages might all use English to communicate. So if you had a business meeting with someone from China, someone from India, someone from Nigeria, it's quite likely that English would be the common language they could all use to communicate. And in different contexts, we use different forms of language. So like I said before, the way that you talk to your friends might be different to the way you talk to your family. The way you talk to your brother or sister might be different to the way you talk to your grandparents. And again, within the world of business, if you're giving a presentation to some clients, or if you're having a meeting with your co-workers, or you're going in for that interview to get the job, it's going to be very different forms, all the same language, but different forms of communication. So we have that variety. So let's have a look at a few examples of this. So like we said, we have all these different domains where we have different forms of communication. So the business world and academia, maybe those two are quite similar in that they're more formal. And we have certain codes, certain vocabularies, certain lexicon that we tend to use more in those situations, which wouldn't be appropriate or normal to use in a casual situation. So like we mentioned, a casual situation would be talking with your friends, talking with your family. Formal occasions, we'll talk about these more later, but that could be something like a traditional event, like a wedding. They follow very ritualized forms of communication, which again would be distinct from business and academia. And then finally, a huge aspect nowadays is that communication online or face-to-face. And as we'll see, this distinction between online and face-to-face actually tends to blur the distinction between verbal and or written and spoken communication as well. So it does become quite complicated, and it's easy to say, I know English, I speak English, but what does that mean in all these different situations? Can be quite different. Okay, so professional communication, we're not really concerned at the moment about academia, casual conversations. We're focusing on professional communication. So it has some particular qualities. The goal is to communicate clearly or persuade the audience. So if you're in a casual, informal situation, you're with people who you already have a good relationship with. In business, you're trying to persuade your audience. So that might be people who you don't know, who you really need to impress, or you have very complicated information that you need to share and make sure that the parties receiving it can understand that clearly. Like I said, it deals with technical and complex information. So this is where in more informal or casual situations, there might be more ambiguity and humor. But in professional communication, because we're dealing with this technical and complex information, and that could be related to money or data or health, it could be quite high stakes situations. It's really important to get your message across clearly and make sure the other party understands. And again, what complicates that scenario is that the participants are often from different backgrounds and different nationalities, might speak different first languages. So even as a native English speaker, there might be miscommunications, for instance, with people from the USA, because we have different vocabulary, slightly different meaning. Consider the fact that you might be a non-native English speaker communicating with another non-native English speaker, and you have added layers of complexity. Okay, and then as we've touched on this before, but professional communication is formal instead of informal. So because it's formal, there's a high degree of politeness and the maintaining of some social distance. This isn't very familiar or kind of comfortable communication. You want to show that there's an amount of respect and courtesy between you and your interlocutor. And that might change once you get to know people, but certainly in the first instance, it should be more polite, more formal. And because of this, it's quite highly controlled and follows convention. So business English, this is not where you need to necessarily have a ton of variety in your vocabulary and to be looking for really beautiful, flowery phrases and metaphors. It's not poetry. It needs to follow convention so that everyone involved can understand what's going on and that information is clear and everyone feels respected. And this, again, a really important point, that employees, this is not your personal self-expression of how you feel inside. You're representing your company. It's not about your personal interest or personality. So maybe you have another way of that self-expression. But in professional communication, think about your business that you're working for and your reputation, because that's what you're representing, not yourself personally. So this is the main idea of this module, is that there are three main forms of communication. This is what we're really going to look at. So these are oral, written, and non-verbal. So it's quite a simple distinction, although as we'll see in later modules, not quite as clear-cut as it might first appear. Oral refers to speech, so like I'm doing now, I'm communicating using my mouth to create sounds. That's a usually more straightforward way of communicating than writing, at least for native speakers, not the case for non-native speakers. It takes less conscious effort to speak. Written text, as you can see on this slide, that would be the text written here. And there's extra layers to that process because the thoughts or the speech has been transcribed into text. So it's more formalized, it's more permanent, more grammatical than spoken English, or any language, I suppose. And then non-verbal, which can seem quite unusual and quite hard to wrap your head around, but it's any form of communication without words or language. So oral and written communication are both using words and language. Non-verbal communication doesn't use that. So you might be thinking, how does that happen? And it's a lot more common than you might expect, and really important. Something to bear in mind, which we will look at in more detail, is these different forms each have their advantages and disadvantages and are useful in different circumstances. So I'm not here to say you should focus on oral or you should focus on written. All of them in different circumstances are used in different ways for different effects. So it's important that you have a good grasp of all these different forms. So that's the end of this introduction module. So obviously we've just been looking quite generally at these different forms of communication. We'll look in more detail later, but we've learned what professional communication is and compared it to some other forms of communication which aren't the focus of this module. We've talked about why we use professional communication. So it's in business contexts, and we're using it to communicate complicated ideas clearly, to enhance your reputation, to talk to people from different backgrounds, different nationalities, different first languages. So it's all about clarity, politeness, formality in professional communication. We've talked about when to use it and what forms it takes. So obviously there could be things like business meetings, presentations. We're going to look at more examples in later modules. And like any form of communication, it could be oral, written, or non-verbal. And we'll look at that balance and how and when to use those different forms of communication. Thank you.